Welcome to this brief introductory video into the brainstem. In this short module, we will be exploring the structures and the specific features of the midbrain, pons, and medulla. It is important to note that given the fact that this was not taken from a live cadaver, there are some anatomical differences, especially as they pertain to the relationship with the pons and medulla, which we will get into shortly. Let's first start by looking at an inferior view of the superficial anterior structures of the brainstem. The most superior portion is known as the midbrain, or mesencephalon. Important to note within this region are the cerebral peduncles found on the sides here, as well as the ocular motor nerve, or cranial nerve 3, as it courses between the PCA, or posterior cerebral artery, and SCA, or superior cerebellar artery, as seen here. As we move down into the pons, we can appreciate the transverse fibers of the pons, especially as we apply different tissue densities. These transverse fibers and their axons run into the middle cerebellar peduncles found bilaterally on the brainstem off of the pons. We can also note the trigeminal nerve, or cranial nerve 5, as it comes off, as seen here. Inferior to the pons is the medulla, which has both open and closed forms. In this scan, as I mentioned, was not taken from a live human, so there is some structural abnormalities in the sense that the medulla would typically descend inferiorly directly from the pons, but instead in this image appears to wrap posteriorly. We will be taking different views to appreciate some of those structures, but of this open medulla, we have two longitudinal bulges running along midline known as the pyramids, and on the superior aspects of the medulla, just lateral to those pyramids, we have our inferior olives, as seen here, and better appreciated in that cross-section. Let's move to the posterior aspect of the brain. As we cut in, we can make note of a few important structures within this region. Going to window my data a little bit to bring out the superior and inferior colliculi, key features of the midbrain. Also important to note is cranial nerve 4, or the trochlear nerve, which is the only cranial nerve arising from the posterior aspect of the brainstem. We can also see the fourth ventricle ascending down throughout the posterior aspect, which we'll explore more in detail in a moment. Let's look at some of these structures from a cross-sectional view. As I cut down this axial plane, I can begin to orient my image such that I have anterior down and posterior up here, and I've cut into the level of the midbrain. Again, I can continue to window my data to bring in and out different nuclei, and I encourage you to take the chance to look at different features and identify nuclei within each of these levels of the brainstem. Most importantly, though, we have those cerebellar peduncles found here and here, the mesencephalic aqueduct in this center area here, as well as the superior and inferior colliculi on that posterior aspect here and here. As we descend even further, we will find ourselves in the region of the pons. At this level, we can really appreciate those transverse fibers running across throughout the pons, as well as those middle cerebellar peduncles found on either side here. I'd also like to take this moment to note some of the nuclei and structures associated with the cerebellum, which you are also encouraged to explore, such as the dentate or fastigial nuclei. Located here, we have a large fourth ventricle space, which is a key characteristic of the pons. We also have some pontine nuclei and other structures associated with this level. Again, as I traverse down, I will find myself in the open medulla. As mentioned, this is not the epitome of the representation of this medulla. However, we can start to make out some of those inferior olives and pyramid structures. For this purpose, we are going to cut in from a posterior aspect, as that will give us the best visualization of this open and closed medulla, given the nature of the compressed brainstem in this scan. Here, we can still appreciate some of those pyramids and inferior olives found on the anterior side, and we can note that we are higher up or more superior in our brainstem given the presence of these inferior olives. We can also note the more wider structure of an open medulla, but as we descend even further into a closed medulla, we lose those inferior olives, as well as that space that used to hold the fourth ventricle becomes narrow. We can also continue to traverse even further and note how we find ourselves within the cervical region of the spinal cord segment, which is an excellent transition from our brainstem to our spinal cord. Again, traversing down. I encourage you to explore this scan on your own time, as well as follow along with the learning objectives and instructions outlined on the PowerPoint, and don't hesitate to reach out with any questions.